We're ready then. Lillian, we'll hear your 7-minute constructive speech.
All right, I will start my time now. All right, I will be the first speaker arguing in support of the motion, the United States federal government should militarily intervene in the Tigray War. The Tigray War, just to give a little bit of background, is between the Eritrean Defense Forces and the Ethiopian government, and they are against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is basically a sub-ethnic group in North Ethiopia. We are defining military intervention as the U.S. federal government sending troops to secure internal borders and to stop further aggression on both sides. So they would act as a mediator between peace talks, but would also occupy the country. And for our weighing mechanism, we are going to be using utilitarianism. So the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So the reason that we would send the U.S. troops to secure the borders and to stop the war is because both Ethiopia and Tigray would agree to this. There has been, they have tried declaring truces before. There have been peace talks that have started to happen. But what happens is that when they start to have a peace talk, then one side has grown suspicious of the other side. And then what happens is then it ends up sort of a mess again. So the U.S. troops would help, the U.S. presence would help administer this conversation and stop aggression from either side. We would also implement the plan as soon as possible. So our first contention is that this would restore peace to Ethiopia. In the status quo, one, we see that there are major harms due to this war, right? Between 385,000 to 600,000 people have died as a result of this war. 2.3 million children have been cut access to humanitarian aid. People are lacking access to clean water. There's a lot of hunger. There's been violence against women perpetrated on both sides. Rape is being used as a war tactic. So clearly there's just a lot. And this war the fighting started in 2020. So just in a little over 2 years, we have seen like a ton of harm come from this war, right? There's a very high death toll. And basically the Tigray region is cut off from all access by the Eritrean government and by the Ethiopian government. So yeah, there's a lot of basically people don't have any access. So under the plan, the U.S. federal government would stop fighting. This is our first sub point. So they would stop fighting by occupying the borders. They would basically be like drawing a line in the sand. And this is because both parties want peace talks, right? The Tigray leading officials stopped a succession because they want to actually have peace discussions and they want to be part of Ethiopia. But three, the thing that's been preventing peace talks is that one side starts feeling threatened again and ends up attacking the other side, which furthers the progression of the war. We can trust the U.S. to be a neutral standard in this because the U.S. wants there to be peace, right? We want less people to die. And there's no long history of distrust with the U.S. government. So when the war stops and peace discussions begin, this will restore peace in the area. And so the impacts here are that you see a higher quality of life for everyone in the region, less deaths, and the atrocities are stopped, right? You see less of the deaths and the violence against women and the hunger. So yeah. And the second contention is that this allows for humanitarian aid. In the status quo, one, aid is incredibly hard to come by in the Tigray region. Two, Ethiopia allowed for a brief truce in March, but it fell through in August. Only during that truce was humanitarian aid possible. And three, since fighting has resumed, Ethiopia has blocked further aid to the region. And four, Tigray desperately needs the help, right? The region is often without electricity, running water. Hospitals are forced closed. There's a lack of food and a lack of clean water, right? And so there are many children and adults that are starving. So what would happen when we pass a plan is that one, U.S. troops in the region enable access to humanitarian aid through airports and through just allowing the presence of humanitarian aid, right? The UN can now come in and deliver, and UNICEF can now deliver humanitarian aid, right? Because the U.S. is acting as a peacekeeper. Two, the aid comes at no debt to Ethiopia. The Tigray region won't feel like it's being backed into a corner, and so they won't refuse the aid. So the impacts here are that we are immediately alleviating the loss of life and the low quality of life for millions of people living in the Tigray region. We are getting them food, medical supplies, and getting them clean drinking water. This will immediately alleviate the loss of life that's currently happening, because some of the deaths that have happened because of this war is because there's just lack of access to resources. So this will immensely benefit the people in the region who before, are starving, right? But if we pass the plan, then they actually have access. So with more time, they will be able to talk about why. With more time brought by the U.S. Occupying Ethiopia, or occupying Ethiopia and the Tigray region, the U.S. will be able to maintain peace, right? Because there's going to be a militia in the area, then the U.S. will be able, then the Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government, and the Tigray region will actually be able to have these conversations that lead them to have like a peace agreement, versus if there's no presence in that region, then the war will continue, and there's no way for them to have, there's no one to facilitate that conversation and give them space to have that conversation without a fear of retaliation and suspicion of the other side, like we've already seen. So for all of these reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian. We'll now call upon the first speaker for the opposition, Max, for a speech of 8 minutes maximum.
All right, thank you so much. Great speech. So just for a quick off-time roadmap, I'm going to go over top of case, and then I'll get into our one contention and our many subpoints, and then also I'll propose our counter plan as the opposition team. Going to start time now. So before I do my own definitions and values, I would just like to state that my opponents did not implement a specific plan, meaning they have no exact dollar amount, they have no agency carrying out this military intervention, they also have no time frame. That's fine. We just kind of have to infer exactly what they mean by that. But it also just means that it's not super specific, and it'll make this round a little bit harder to debate. With that out of the way, I do agree with their definitions of what military intervention is. This is actually sending in troops occupying Ethiopia. We also agree with what the Tigray War is. And we also agree with the value of utilitarianism, which again is the most amount of good for the most amount of people. And we believe that whatever side does provide the most amount of good for the most amount of people should win today's round. Moving on to my partner and I's case, our first and only contention is that military intervention in Ethiopia is not the solution. So for our main contention, we're going to show you that military intervention is never a good idea, especially by the US, and only bad things come out of it, like death, atrocities, human rights abuses, and lingering resentment to America. So our subpoint A is that military intervention will not end the conflict. It's a bad idea for the US to send military troops into poorer countries, or really any foreign country, because it does nothing to solve the issue and it only takes more lives. For example, when we sent our army into Vietnam in an effort to stop the Viet Cong and their aggressions, the ethnic Vietnamese resisted and eventually we were forced to stop fighting. We lost that war. Through the use of guerrilla warfare, stealth, and camouflage, the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were actually able to beat the American army. And the Vietnam War lasted over 10 years. No real change happened, and communism ultimately took control of Vietnam as soon as we left. The impact of this is that in Vietnam, nothing happened except for the deaths of around 58,000 Americans and around 3 million Vietnamese. And in Ethiopia, an extremely similar failure will occur. The US will not be able to end the fighting. It will just result in more death and more conflict. Another example, our military intervention in Afghanistan did nothing except for result in the deaths of so many people for more than 20 years. And when the Biden administration pulled American troops out of Afghanistan, the entire country was almost immediately taken over by the Taliban. So we tried to do this thing where we tried to build democracy. We tried to bridge the peace between the civilian government and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And it ended in absolute shambles. It ended in the Taliban just taking over again. Yes, I'll take your POI.
Do you really think that the US government was trying to negotiate a peace deal with the Taliban?
Absolutely. I think that the role of the US government in Afghanistan is they were trying to negotiate with the Taliban and the civilian government, get them to come to a compromise and get peace in Afghanistan and allow for a democratic government to exist. And since the Taliban are a very powerful force in Afghanistan, it is necessary to talk to them and negotiate with the Taliban. And that's what we have been doing in Afghanistan. However, like I said, that has failed. The Taliban took over. Afghanistan is now ruled by this incredibly oppressive totalitarian regime. And that's incredibly sad because it shows the US failure of trying to establish a democratic state in Afghanistan. Again, we failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Vietnam, we will fail again in Ethiopia because the US, it shows our track record is very bad for being able to actually stop conflict in foreign countries. So our next subpoints are kind of about the negative effects of US intervention other than the fact that it will fail. I'd like to issue a trigger warning because I'm going to be talking about a lot of war crimes here. So when the US stations soldiers in foreign countries, atrocities are committed against the people of that country. For example, in some cases, US soldiers on extended deployment have been known to brutally rape civilians. A prime example of this is in Iraq, where the Iraq Mahmudiya rape and killings of 2006, in which US soldiers actually raped a 14-year-old Iraqi girl and then killed her entire family. This actually happened. When we went into Iraq, we did things like this. And it will happen again if there's US deployment in Ethiopia, because the fact is we commit horrible crimes against the people of foreign countries. Give another example of this. When the US was fighting in France during World War II, the sociologist J. Robert Lilly of Northern Kentucky University, he estimates that US servicemen committed around 4,500 rapes in France between June 1944 and the end of the war in May 1945. And France is an ally. It's the Western world. So if we are committing that many of atrocities against the women of France, imagine what we do against the women of Ethiopia, who are not considered as close allies to us as our Western allies, such as France. Impact of this is if the US militarily intervenes in Ethiopia, similar atrocities like this mass rape will be committed, and it will actually hurt the people of Ethiopia far more than any benefit that could possibly have. Our subpoint C is US caused civilian deaths during invasions or interventions. So not only have Americans killed millions of foreign soldiers, but we've also killed millions of civilians as well. Estimates for civilian casualties in the Vietnam War reach a staggering 1.2 million in horrible massacres, such as the famous My Lai massacre. And for another example, in the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, it resulted in the deaths of between 184,000 to around 207,000 civilians. Both of these examples provide proof that when the US intervenes militarily, it doesn't actually end the war. And even when it does, even if we're trying to end the war, the side effects are so horrible. The amount of people killed because of US troops is so high. So even if we were, it's just not worth it, the amount of civilian costs that we are incurring here. Our subpoint D is US image. So other countries will not look very favorably upon us if we continue harassing smaller countries, if we keep pretty much deciding that it's the role of the US to be the global police. And it kind of sets this standard that the US can just step into any country in Africa or the Middle East or wherever it might be, that we just step in and we're the ones that are going to mediate conflicts between other countries. It sets very bad precedent. It sets a very high expectation on the US, and it also makes other countries see us as imperialist, which is bad. And the impact of this is we get less political bargaining power if other countries see us as imperialist and essentially greedy and just wanting to be pretty much the police of the entire world, which is obviously a problem.
POI.
Yes.
If other countries view us as maintaining peace in other parts of the world, won't they see the US as favorable?
I don't think so, especially because we're likely to fail to maintain the peace. You could argue we were trying to bring about an end to the war in Vietnam. You could argue we were trying to bring about peace in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the result of that, like I said, was civilian deaths and ultimate failure. So I think just like in those instances, the US would be looked at as, again, imperialist and as causing immense harm to civilians. Moving on, our subpoint E for this contention is US spending. And I haven't actually seen the dollar amount of my opponent's plan. So this is going to be pretty vague impact, but essentially the idea that we should not be spending a huge amount of money right now on military intervention. Obviously spending or sending troops costs a lot of money. Our military in general, paying for equipment, paying for helicopters, paying soldiers, that's a lot of money, which we certainly do not have and could contribute to things like inflation. So with my last minute or so, I'll briefly establish our counter plan. Our counterplan is that instead of intervening militarily in the Tigray conflict, we'll allocate about $500 million in humanitarian aid to the country of Ethiopia. We'll do this to pay for, say, medical supplies, rebuild destroyed infrastructure, and give food to starving people. We'll also try to send diplomats to peacefully resolve the conflict instead of in military intervention. Our time frame will be in the next couple of years, funding through normal means / out of the U.S. foreign aid budget, and it'll be carried out through USAID. Again, our impacts here is that we'll save thousands of lives through humanitarian support by giving people medicine, giving people food, shelter, rebuilding infrastructure. And if U.S. diplomats are able to peacefully resolve the conflict, we could be able to do that without U.S. military intervention. So for all those reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the opposition. Again, my opponent's case will be covered by my partner in his first speech. Thank you.
All right, I have 8 minutes. I'm going to briefly talk about some top of case thing and any confusion regarding our plan. And then I'm going to go into the opposition case. I will start my time now. So the first thing that the opposition brings up in this round is the idea that the government team, we do not have a plan. However, we have presented you with a plan at the top of the case. We have given you a definition of what military intervention would be and what it would look like. We are telling you that what the government team is doing is we are sending US troops to secure internal borders in Ethiopia to stop any further aggression and to act as mediators for peace talks. This is a plan. We've given you a timeline. We tell you that this is going to happen ASAP. The opposition just tells you, oh, they have no timeline. Oh, they have no plan. This is not true. The one gripe is that we don't have a clear issue of funding. Fine, let's clear that up now. The funding for this military intervention would come from our military budget, which is already big enough. We have trillions of dollars in our military budget. We are not really engaged in any other military intervention. We have a surplus in our military budget. We will just use that money. Now let's go into the opposition case. Their only contention is that military intervention is not the solution, right? And they basically give this claim that like bad things happen when the US intervenes, and they give us several examples. So let's break down these examples one by one. First, they bring up this example of Vietnam, right? The invasion of Vietnam was a failure. And the government agrees. The invasion of Vietnam is a failure, right? Like it did not work. However, what the government plan is doing is we are not invading Ethiopia. We are not trying to crush the Tigray region. We are not like fighting a guerrilla war, right? It's just not a comparable example. We are not going to spend decades in Ethiopia trying to defeat some party, right? We are simply there to stop current fighting and to engage in peace talks, right? Which is what both Ethiopia and the Tigray region want, right? The Tigray region outlined that in order for any peace negotiation to happen again, there would need to be an external mediator that does it. Because in Ethiopia and Tigray have tried, and it's failed because of equal suspicion on both sides. And the other example they give up is Afghanistan, right? They're saying that Afghanistan was a failure. When we pulled out, it didn't work. First off, I would argue that US intervention in Afghanistan, while it was happening, was not a failure. For the 20 years we were in Afghanistan, we maintained peace. We established democratic systems. We provided livelihoods for the Afghani citizens. While the US was in the region, we maintained peace. Second off, this situation is also different than Afghanistan. The opposition tries to make you believe that the US was in Afghanistan to broker some peace deal between the Taliban and the democratic government of Afghanistan. But that's not true at all. The US military was in Afghanistan in order to crush the Taliban and any other Islamic terrorist organizations, right? This is just not true. I asked them in a POI, did the US try to mediate peace deals with the Taliban? No, they didn't. Their goal was to crush the Taliban. Yes, I will take your POI.
Okay, so you're saying that the US presence in Afghanistan actually was successful. So to that, I have to say, did the US presence in Afghanistan do anything to help further the rights of women?
Yes. Moving on. They say that, furthermore, third key difference, we are not nation building in Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia and Tigray are all already regions with governments, right? We're not going to create a democracy from scratch in both regions. We are not rebuilding the whole social hierarchy. This is just not at all comparable to Afghanistan in terms of size, in terms of scale, like those words are synonyms. But the point is, this is not a good example to be using in this round and does not actually substantiate the opposition's claim. Their second point is that when the U.S. is stationed somewhere, war crimes will happen. And they give like the example of when the U.S. was actively waging war in World War II, right? And the government agrees war is bad. There's no side that looks good in war, right? There's always some side that is like all sides are doing bad things. All sides are killing people. All sides are committing war crimes, right? But looking at the situation in Ethiopia and the Tigray region, it's really bad, right? Almost 600,000 people have died. Millions of people are left without food, water, shelter, right? We see a massive amount of war crimes, right? And the point is, the U.S., like, while we agree that, war, like with the United States, the U.S. has bad things in war. We are not going to be waging war in Ethiopia or the Tigray region. We are stopping the current war that's happening in the region. We are putting our presence there, and we are stopping further engagement. So what we see is that, like, this is like non-unique under the opposition world. They talk about the atrocities that are committed during war, but this is happening under the opposition world. Right, and it's happening worse under the opposition world because the atrocities that are being committed on both sides in the Tigray War conflict are much, 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 much worse than really horrible, but also not very common incidents like in Iraq or continuing on or in other scenarios. Their third point on this is a bad image for the United States that other countries will see the United States as bad, but this is not true. Like, if the United States is like known for being able to maintain peace in regions, and the United States is like doing the work and is like delivering humanitarian aid, and this is just going to help our image on a global scale. On a global scale, but furthermore, they don't really give any impact as to why this actually matters. So I would just strike it from the round. Their fourth point is U.S. spending. They say that this like will contribute to inflation, but that's just not necessarily true. They give like no warranting as to how military spending contributes to inflation, and they also just say that basically we don't have the money, but like we do. We have like trillions of dollars in our military budget. And then they get to their counterplan, which several responses. Their counterplan is basically put in diplomats and give $500 million for aid. Several responses. First off, we on the government team already give you an argument that Ethiopia is blocking humanitarian aid to the Tigray region, right? This humanitarian aid is not going to reach anybody, right? And the opposition team gives no way of actually having this happen, right? So that whole point of the counterplan doesn't work. And they give no solution as to how this would work, given that they have not engaged with their argument at all in their speech. Their second thing is diplomats. They say that diplomats will solve this. They will deal to peace sides. Several responses to this. First off, they haven't so far. Diplomats are already there, right? We already have embassy in Ethiopia. We already have diplomats there, and it's not working, right? The point is, the issue that is happening is Ethiopia and Tigray are so threatened by each other that they cannot trust each other, even with a diplomatic presence there. What needs to happen is there needs to be a direct promise by the United States that we can guarantee no fighting. And the way we do that is through military presence there, is by stopping the fighting, is by literally stopping them from meeting each other on the battlefield. Right? That is how we stop the war, because diplomats is the status quo and hasn't been working. So this counterplan is, first off, basically the status quo in terms of diplomats. And second off, humanitarian aid doesn't work. And it hasn't worked because Ethiopia is blocking it. So you should just totally disregard any solvency the op seems to claim in this round, because the opposition is not actually solving any of the issues within the Tigray-Ethiopian war. They are not solving the conflict, and they're letting the current atrocities continue. And the opposition has not actually responded to any part of the government case. They have agreed. So therefore you should let this flow through. They've implicitly agreed to the fact that U.S. presence there would maintain peace. By physically having the troops there, we are stopping the two sides from meeting each other. This is just a fact which has gone unresponded to by the opposition case and should not be responded to as they move on in this round. For those reasons, you should vote for the government team. Thank you.
Thank you to the second government speaker. We'll now hear from the second opposition speaker, Dylan, for a speech of maximum 8 minutes.
Okay, perfect. All right, let me just set up my timer. Okay, if everybody's ready, I will start my 8-minute speech. All right, I will begin time in 3, 2, 1, now. Hello, everybody. I'm Dylan. I'm the second speaker to the negation of the resolution that the United States federal government should militarily intervene in the Tigray War. So to begin, I'm going to talk about some of the points that our opponents made. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about their plan. And then finally, I'm going to defend some of the things that my partner said previously. So with that, I will get into their first contention, that this is that the Ethiopian government and the Tigrays would both agree to United States intervention. They say that they're suspicious of each other during truces, and the U.S. presence will help prevent this suspicion. But they have provided no warrants that they have not proven at all that U.S. presence will lead to more peace talks and will reduce suspicion. They just said that it would. And we actually think that this isn't true at all. This will not help reduce peace talks. And if anything, it will make the tension worse and lead to more death, as my partner points out in his contention. So not only did they not tell you why, but we have substantial evidence pointing to how the opposite could happen. Because as we've proven through the many geopolitical conflict examples, when we go into a foreign country, the foreigners don't appreciate our presence there. And the Ethiopians won't appreciate foreigners stepping into their country and telling them what to do, like the military. They need diplomacy, and they need more diplomats creating more peace talks and opening more doors for them to cooperate with each other. Now, starting with their their second contention, I'll take it after this second contention. Starting with the second contention, they're saying that there are a lot of people dying in Ethiopia. People don't have food and access to healthcare. And we think this is horrible, and we agree with them. So that's why we want to do everything we can in order to help. So we are providing humanitarian aid. Only the difference is we have all the good and none of the bad, because our army isn't going to be stepping in and abusing the people. So essentially, we're doing exactly what they are doing, but have all of the positives and none of the negatives. We do what they do, but we do it better. When they talk about the high death toll and how military intervention will help solve this, the death toll is going to only be made higher by United States intervention, because when we come in, more tension builds, more escalation, and then we start fighting against the Ethiopians, causing more death, and then it's just a repeat of all the historical precedents that we've laid out. And then they're talking about the rape as a war tactic going on between both sides in the war. But as we've pointed out many times, the US military has many rapists in it too. So how is the American military any better in terms of human rights abuses? And finally, they say that the US will remain neutral in this war, but this is just simply not true, because the US is just going to back whoever is convenient for us. It's saying that we're completely unbiased and we're completely neutral is simply not true, because every time we support a side, just look at all of the African conflicts during the Cold War and see how every time we supported a side. Even look at Ethiopia, where we switched sides because the side that we were previously supporting switched to communism. So we are just going to support whoever is convenient for us, and we're not going to be neutral at all. There's so many historical precedents to prove this. POI. And yes, I'll take your POI now.
How will U.S. diplomats help negotiate peace if they are clearly biased to one side?
Well, we're not talking about diplomats being biased to one side. We're talking about the government and the military being biased to one side. The government just wants to do whatever is the sheer maximum political advantage. But diplomats are pacifists and they want what's best for everybody. So they're going to start making peace talks. The army is just going to do whatever the government tells them to and commit atrocities. So now moving on to their third and final contention, they say that this military intervention will allow for humanitarian aid. They say that truce is necessary for humanitarian aid, but the humanitarian aid is not part of the resolution for them. The resolution says military intervention. So they should only be arguing about military intervention. And then they also say that the UN can send aid if there's a truce. We can send aid if there's a truce, but that's not necessarily true. We don't need a truce to send medical supplies or food. Nobody's going to refuse that. And we can help the people and civilians on both sides. Because why would one side refuse receiving food from from Americans or refuse receiving medication. And then finally, when they say that there's more time bought by the US that will allow for future aid, and we need peace in order for aid, we agree, but we have one disagreement, which is we think we need to give aid right now and not maybe sometime in the future. And our plan provides immediate relief right now and saves relief right now with the money that we're going to be pouring in. And as my partner pointed out, our opponents have a very vague time frame and a very vague overall plan. And they've only now just talked about it in their second speech after we pointed that out, while we have a much more solvent plan than them. So now I'm going to be talking about some of the things they said about our contentions with my remaining time. When in our subpoint A, when we talk about the Vietnam War, they agree with us that the Vietnam War was a failure, but that this is different because we're not invading and we're not going to be spending decades in Ethiopia. But the problem with this way of thinking is that that's exactly what we thought about Vietnam. That's exactly what we thought about Afghanistan and Iraq. We all thought that it was going to be in and out. It was going to be quick, and it was going to be a quick end of the war, and peace would happen immediately. But every time it's drawn out and there's an extended conflict. I'm sorry, did somebody POI me? Okay, yes. Never mind. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
What was the US goal in Vietnam?
The US goal in Vietnam was a pretty biased effort in order to contain the spread of communism. And it was sort of a proxy war going on between the USSR and the Cold War. So now I'm going to move on. They say that the US intervention in Iraq was not a failure. And while it was happening, it wasn't a failure. During the 20 years we were there, we had peace. But then as soon as we left, what always happens, it collapsed. Iraq collapsed, and we cannot have our troops there forever because it's not sustainable. Or sorry, not Iraq, Afghanistan. They were claiming Afghanistan was not a failure, but Afghanistan was a failure. And just as I said, we cannot have our troops in there forever. It's not sustainable. And when I POI'd my opponent and asked if the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan did anything to help further women's rights, and he said, yes, this is just a straight up lie. You can read Malala's autobiography. You can read Shia law in Afghanistan. This is simply not true. None of this so-called change has been made that my opponent is talking about, and you can't flow that through. So I'm out of time now, but with the grace period I'm going into, I would just like to urge a very strong vote for my partner and I. Military aid is not the solution. Intervention is not the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear a 4-minute rebuttal speech from the first opposition speaker, Max. Yeah. Okay. No new arguments are permitted or questions.
All right. Thank you very much. If everyone, the opponents are ready and the rest of the judges. Yep. Okay. Just do a quic off-time roadmap. I'm mainly just going to talk about points of clash, and then I might get into some specific impacts of this round and do kind of like a case-by-case comparison. Going to start my 4-minute speech now. So again, we're on the opposition side of this resolution. The United States federal government should militarily intervene in the Tigray War, meaning we're saying they should not militarily intervene, is what my partner and I are saying. So I'm going to talk about our plans really quickly. Again, their plan is pretty much to send in troops, try to mediate between the two factions, militarily intervene, have boots on the ground, stop the two from fighting. Our plan is to not do any of that, not send in the military. Instead, we're going to send, again, $500 million in humanitarian aid in the form of medical supplies, food, rebuilding infrastructure, stuff like that. So talking about some points of clash, the first point of clash I see here is if either team is able to stop the fighting in Ethiopia. And I believe that neither team will be successful in stopping the fighting. But if anyone would be, it would actually be the opposition team. So my opponent claims that the US, if we send boots on the ground, if we send in troops, we'll be able to kind of get the two sides to stop fighting. I believe this is completely untrue. And I think history is on our side. The US has failed time and time again to be able to stop these conflicts from going down. We can look at Vietnam. We can look at Afghanistan. We can look at Iraq. And really, I think the best example of this is Afghanistan, because we went in, yes, we initially toppled the Taliban, we put in place the civilian government, and then for years and years, we tried to mediate peace between the two sides, and we tried to stop the Taliban from being aggressive. The Taliban, in a lot of ways, are very similar to the Tigray faction. I'm not going to say they're the same, but there are some similarities there. And we failed to stop peace, or we failed to continue to have peace in Afghanistan. This is the exact same situation. There were peace talks in Afghanistan, and obviously there would be peace talks here, again, with military intervention. So that was a complete failure. We also look at Iraq, again, a complete failure. US intervened, we killed a lot of civilians. We ultimately didn't achieve what we wanted to. We really destabilized the entire region, and it's because of our actions in Iraq that things with ISIS happened. We can also look at Vietnam. We can look how we went in, we tried, we said this will just be a quick interaction, we'll get in, we'll defeat the Viet Cong, we'll get out, we'll restore peace in the region. We didn't do that. It doesn't matter that the specific details are slightly different in this situation. If there is US military presence and we are trying to stop a conflict between two sides or bring about an end to a foreign conflict, we will fail, and we have always failed. My opponent has zero solvency because all of the impacts they claim depend on them ending the war in Ethiopia, which the United States government will not succeed in doing. On to the second point of clash I want to talk about is what the actual impact of what will happen to the people of Ethiopia. So if we try to stop this war with military force, we look at all of the impacts in my partner and I's case. You can just cross-apply all of our subpoints, really. You can talk about our subpoint B, the US rape of civilians. Even if we aren't fighting, just having US military forces there will likely result in the rape of civilians, just like we did in Iraq in 2006 when US soldiers raped a 14-year-old girl. Just like we did in France, our ally, when US servicemen committed around 4,500 rapes, again, of an ally. That same thing will happen, and the impact of that is huge. You can also look at civilian deaths. If this turns into a conflict where the US military is fighting, where the US military is somehow taking a side or doing counter-terror operations, that will result in a lot of civilian deaths. Just like the 1.2 million civilian deaths in Vietnam, or the around 200,000 civilian deaths in Iraq. Again, this is a huge impact. We're supposed to be helping these people, but what will happen, what always happens, is civilian deaths. Also talking about US image, it'll help the US will be seen as more imperialist. The foreigners are not going to appreciate us stepping in and telling them what to do. This is exactly the same thing that happened in the Middle East and in Vietnam. It will decrease US foreign image, decrease our bargaining power, make us look like pretty much a monster. So really comparing these two worlds, in our world as the opposition, we provide humanitarian aid to the people, which will be able to get through. No one's going to refuse medical supplies. We're helping both sides with this humanitarian aid, going into my grace period here. So we're helping both sides by giving them medicine, giving them food, giving them water. We're able to actually save lives. In contrast, in my opponent's world, they take lives, they cause civilian deaths, they cause rape of civilians, and they decrease US image. So for all those reasons, I urge a strong vote for the opposition. Thank you very much.
All right.
Finally, Lillian. Okay.
I will start my time now. So when weighing this debate, I am going to talk about 3 voting issues that will help you guys decide who to vote for. My voting issues are going to be 1, discussions of peace, 2, human life, and 3, humanitarian aid. So for the first voting issue, discussions of peace, the Gov side provides more likelihood for peace discussions, period. When troops occupy Tigray and Ethiopia, war will stop. Both Tigray and Ethiopia have agreed that they want peace, but the issue is that they are constantly feeling threatened militarily by the other side. This goes unresponded to by the opposition. What's necessary is to make both sides feel like they can't militarily threaten each other anymore, and occupation is the only way to do that. The US is not invading either Ethiopia or Tigray to wage war. They are not nation building. The op gives examples of Vietnam and Afghanistan, but these don't make sense because the objectives with Vietnam and Afghanistan were very different from occupation, just peace from occupation, right? In Vietnam, we were basically fighting a war for France, and in Afghanistan, we were trying to stop the Taliban. We were trying to stop the progression of terrorism, right? These are not occupations just based on peace. So we on the Gov tell you that this is not what we're doing in Ethiopia, and the situation will be approached completely differently. In response to our responses, it just says it doesn't matter that there's differences, right? It does matter that we would be approaching this differently. So the Gov wins on discussions of peace because discussions of peace cannot happen in a war-torn region, which is what the opposition is arguing for, right? The only side that stops the war is the government side. My second voting issue is human life. Gov wins on utilitarianism because of human life, because the US troops are there to occupy and stop fighting. Nowhere in the op case do they explicitly say that their counterplan will stop the war, right? And as you can see, the war is the largest thing that's causing the deaths. And so if we're talking about the Gov bringing in US troops, right, and actually occupying and stopping the war, then we are going to save more lives. It has nothing like, basically, it has nothing to do there. It has nothing to do with peace. It just has to do with stopping the war, right? That's why we win on human lives. Gov wins because Gov restores peace, stops death from war, and actually allows for humanitarian aid. So my third voting issue is going to be humanitarian aid. The Gov wins on humanitarian aid because as of right now, Ethiopian Gov is blocking aid to the Tigray region where millions of people are starving. Gov stops war and allows for humanitarian aid to actually reach the Tigray people, right? We're talking millions of people in this region who cannot reach the aid. Just the US presence there, even if peace is not immediately negotiated, will allow for the facilitation of humanitarian aid, and it will allow for access to airports and allow for UNICEF to go in there, right? In administrative humanitarian aid, right? So Gov wins for humanitarian aid because there is no way under the op world for humanitarian aid to actually get to Tigray. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a comparison with the time I have left. And so first going into the government case, right? What the government does is that we send in military intervention to occupy the region, right? And by occupying the region, we are able to facilitate peace talks. And so we stop the deaths that are happening, right? We stop the war and we facilitate talks that will actually end, that we know both Tigray and Ethiopia want to happen. And we know this will lead to the end in the war, right? In the counter plan that the opposition presents you with is that there will be diplomats and there will be 500 million in aid. We've already given you reasons that there can't be any aid to Tigray, right? Ethiopia and Eritrea are blocking all of the aid that is supposed to go to the Tigray region. And so there is no reason that counterplan does not solve for any of the issues that they're trying to weigh on, right? We are allowing for humanitarian aid and we are stopping the war, which are the biggest impacts in this round because they impact the most human lives. So for all of these reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the government. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Great round.
Great work, everyone.
Thank you.
My
everybody.
understanding is that the judges are supposed to each submit your ballots independently, and then whoever's the last one will announce what the outcome was. So you know who's moving on. Great work.
Sounds good. Thanks, judges.
Okay, I think we have our result, which I will announce. If everyone's ready. This was a 2-1 vote for the government. David Goldstein and Lillian Mockler, who are advancing to quarters. Congratulations. Okay. I am the squirrel. I'm the one who voted for the opposition, so I'm happy to provide some feedback if you'd like to hear it. And the other judges are welcome to as well if they would like. I think that both teams in this round made some excellent arguments, but also some strategic errors. From both teams, I heard excellent attacks on solvency and undermining of the likelihood of success of the other side's plan, but I saw fewer disadvantages articulated to the other side's plan. So the government team, I think, set out a great case at the outset. And the opposition made a pretty critical strategic error by not addressing the government case at all in the leader of opposition speech. All we heard was op case. We didn't hear any attacks on the contentions about how this military intervention of the U.S. is a prerequisite for humanitarian aid actually getting to Ethiopia. All of that showed up in the second opposition speech rather than in the first. And I think it would have been a much stronger vote for the op if we had heard it in the first opposition speech. Okay, but we did hear it in the second opposition speech, in the second constructive, where I believe it's Dylan tells us that the government team has not provided a warrant for why there would be why the U.S. presence would be at all successful in paving the way for U.S. aid to actually get to anyone, that there's no historical precedent for that, and that actually it's going to make things worse. And I didn't hear good responses to those new arguments from the Prime Minister in the final rebuttal speech. In terms of the op counter plan, the government very successfully responded to the idea that this humanitarian aid is not going to be successful in getting to anyone in Ethiopia until we have actually sent in a military presence to pave the way for it getting there. But they also didn't tell us any disadvantages of trying to send humanitarian aid. So I thought that if the government team had more clearly said that humanitarian aid is going to actually make things worse, and there are arguments that you can make for that. We have historical precedents of humanitarian aid being resold by combatants, and then the profits from that resale being used to make the war continue or to intensify the scale of the atrocities. That would have been a stronger argument than just telling us it's not going to work. Because at the end of the round, what I'm weighing is a government plan that is likely to cause harm. We have historical precedent for military atrocities committed by U.S. troops in many, many places. And we have no strong warrants for why this is actually going to successfully pave the way for aid getting to Ethiopia. On the op, we have a counter plan that is also unlikely to work, but is less likely to cause harm. The government hasn't told us any disadvantage of the counter plan. So that's why I voted off at the end. It was close. And I think that if the leader of the opposition had made stronger attacks on the government case in the first speech, it would have been a stronger vote for me. But that's where I went at the end. If either of the other two judges want to say anything, you're welcome to.
Sure. My biggest issue with the opposition side was that your whole argument was talking about examples and how those historical examples prove your side. But what I want to see is more of an explanation of how the actual mechanisms of military intervention leads to these issues. Like, so you could talk about how the nature of the issues with the semblance of imperialism, or why the U.S. government has the tendency to pick sides and exacerbate the issues. So there was too much discussion on historical examples, but not actual explanation of how the mechanisms of involvement leads to these issues. The counterexample, as Judge Molly pointed out, the government very effectively struck that down by talking about how it's not a very effective solution. But the opposition, you guys failed to sort of respond to that criticism, and you just continued to push your earlier points about why diplomatic solutions is better. So it would have been better if you actually engaged in a more constructive argument with the actual points the government side was making. But the issue with the government side, that's why I made the government side win. But the government side, you could have improved on the number of points you were bringing. So your main two arguments, which was about allowing humanitarian aid and restoring peace to Ethiopia, those are very two similar points. And so there was not much of uniqueness. So I would have liked it if you introduced more unique, diverse points at the beginning. But what really, I guess, hammered the decision for me was the last speech talking about the weighing mechanisms. That was very convincing for me. And that's why I thought that government side won this debate. But I think both sides did really good. So yeah, you all should be proud of yourselves.
Yeah, I have to say, both the previous judges basically outlined my points on this. I thought that the Gov did a great job in the last speech. This was a really close decision for me too. Of basically what it came down to for me was the efficacy of the plans, and like the previous judge said, the fact that the opposition did not really outline a mechanism for how maybe this humanitarian aid and these diplomats would actually do something. They just kind of said that they would, which is it's a little vague. Sorry, it's a little vague for me. And I think the Gov did a great job of deconstructing that and basically saying, yes, but, how is the humanitarian aid actually going to get there? Stuff like that. For me, for the Gov side, if you were going to talk about some historical precedent other than Vietnam or Afghanistan, or if you wanted to introduce your own, something like the Rwandan genocide would be a good one. Because I'm not sure how much of the history is known about this, but the United Nations did not go in. There was no military intervention, and that's what happened. And I thought when I was just listening to these speeches that would be a strong point, but that's beside the point. I just thought this was a really good debate. It was very close for me, but I thought the Gov just took it in the end.
Great work, everybody. Good luck at the rest of the tournament. Thanks so much for debating.
Thank you, judges. Good luck to Berkeley.
Yes.